The morning sun crept lazily over the horizon, spilling gold across the wide stretch of water that mirrored the sky like polished glass. This was my lake. 23 acres of still serenity carved right into the heart of my 300-acre ranch. The surface rippled gently under the breeze, disturbed only by the distant call of loons and the quiet splash of fish breaking through. It was peaceful, isolated, and mine in every legal, historical, and spiritual sense of the word. Owning this land hadn't come easy. It was my father's before me and his father's before him. Generations had fended off speculators, developers, and self-righteous neighbors who thought they could bully their way into claiming a piece of it. By the time it was my turn to take over, I was already used to dealing with people who thought fences were optional and boundaries were just polite suggestions. But nothing quite prepared me for what was coming next. A few years ago, a housing development sprouted up on the far side of the property line, a shiny, sterile subdivision filled with perfectly identical houses and perfectly nosy people. The place was run by one of those HOAs that thought it was the government. They called themselves Lakeview Estates, despite the small problem that the lake they were admiring wasn't theirs. It was mine. And from the moment the first family moved in, I could tell trouble wasn't far behind. At first, it was harmless curiosity. Joggers stopped along the old fence line, admiring the water and taking selfies. Then came the kayaks, slipping quietly across the lake like trespassers at dawn. When I confronted one of them, the woman laughed and said she thought it was community property. That phrase stuck in my head like a splinter. Community property. It was the start of something that would spiral wildly out of control. Over the months, I noticed more intrusions. Kids swimming, fishing lines dangling from bright plastic boats, and even someone setting up a folding chair on the dock I built myself 20 years ago. Every time I reminded them the lake was private, I got the same smug look, like I was the unreasonable one for wanting to be left alone on my own land. It wasn't long before the HOA board started to take official interest. They sent letters first. Long, pompous paragraphs filled with phrases like community standards, shared natural resource, and collective enjoyment. According to them, my lake had become a shared amenity that was integral to the neighborhood's aesthetic identity. I didn't even bother responding to the first few, but when they started threatening to fine me for restricting access, I knew this was more than ignorance. It was arrogance. I sent copies of the property survey, tax records and deed, all clearly marking the lake within my ranch's boundaries. The line between my land and theirs wasn't ambiguous. It was clearly fenced, mapped, and recorded with the county. Yet the HOA kept pushing. They even hired their own surveyor, some guy who conveniently came back claiming the water naturally extended into their territory because of seasonal runoff. That was the moment I realized logic wasn't going to win this fight. Still, I didn't want war, not yet. I let things calm down, kept to myself, and spent my weekends out on the lake, fishing or just sitting in my old aluminum boat with a cup of coffee, enjoying the silence. For a while, I thought maybe they'd gotten bored of bothering me. I was wrong. One Saturday morning, I noticed a small group of people on the opposite bank. 3 women and 2 men, all wearing bright orange safety vests like they were on some kind of official mission. They set up signs that read, "Private HOA Lake, residents only." My heart skipped. Residents only, on my land. My first instinct was to laugh. But when they started hammering one of those signs into the soil just beyond the fence, my laughter vanished. They weren't joking. They were claiming the lake. That afternoon, I took the signs down, locked the gate leading to the lake road, and posted my own notice, "Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Simple, legal, direct." But I knew the HOA wasn't going to take that quietly. These were people who saw confrontation as a form of entertainment, and it didn't take long for them to prove it. The following week, while I was out checking cattle near the south pasture, I noticed flashing lights reflecting off the water. Red and blue. Sheriff's cruiser lights. My stomach tightened as I rode closer. 2 deputies were parked near the lake, talking to a group of angry-looking HOA members gathered at the fence line. I dismounted, heart pounding, wondering what absurd complaint had brought them here. Apparently, The HOA had called 911 to report that I was illegally occupying public property and harassing community residents. The absurdity of it might have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. They were trying to use law enforcement to intimidate me off my own land, but here's where things took a turn they didn't expect. You see, when I wasn't managing the ranch, I had another job. I worked as the county's emergency services coordinator. In simpler terms, every 911 call that came through in this part of the county went across my desk, or more accurately, through my office network. And that meant when the HOA made that call, claiming a violent property dispute at Lakeview, it didn't go to a random dispatcher. It came straight to me. I'd seen the report come in while sipping coffee in my office that morning. The moment I saw the address, I knew exactly what was going on. I dispatched 2 deputies to respond, standard procedure. But I also flagged the incident myself for property ownership verification. I wanted this on the record, clean and official. Standing there by the lake, watching those deputies explain to the HOA president that the land and the water belonged entirely to me, I felt something close to satisfaction. Their confident smirks faltered as the law they'd tried to weaponize turned back on them. The officers even reminded them that making false reports could result in charges. The HOA members scattered quickly, muttering among themselves, their bright vests vanishing behind the houses like defeated soldiers. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought maybe they'd finally understand the line that separated community from private property. But as the last cruiser pulled away and silence returned to the ranch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. The HOA had embarrassed themselves publicly, and people like that didn't take humiliation lightly. I didn't know it yet, but the call to 911 was only the beginning. They weren't done trying to claim my lake, and next time they weren't coming with hammers and signs. They were coming with lawyers, loopholes, and lies, and by the time I found out just how far they were willing to go, it would already be too late to turn back. The following week passed in uneasy silence. The lake, once a place of calm, seemed heavier now, its mirror-like surface reflecting more than just the sky. It reflected tension, pride, and a quiet warning that something beneath the surface was stirring. I went about my usual chores, checking fences, rotating the cattle, maintaining the barns. But the thought of the HOA still lingered in the back of my mind, like the hum of distant thunder. They had embarrassed themselves when the sheriff confirmed the property lines. But people like that rarely accepted defeat. Their pride couldn't stand it. I half expected a knock on the door the very next morning or some new letter in the mailbox filled with self-important legal jargon. Yet for nearly a week, nothing came. It almost made me uneasy. When people who thrive on control go quiet, it's never because they've given up, it's because they're planning. And then, one Tuesday morning, the letter arrived. It came in an unassuming white envelope. But the return address made my chest tighten. County Land Use and Development Office. I opened it at the kitchen table, the smell of coffee still hanging in the air, and began to read. The letter was formal, carefully worded, and thick with bureaucratic tone. It stated that the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association had submitted an official claim of shared jurisdiction over the lake and requested a review of the property's boundaries under public easement and environmental access statutes. In simpler words, they were trying to make my lake public. They argued that due to community use, environmental impact, and public recreation interest, the lake should fall under joint oversight between private ownership and the HOA. It was ridiculous, legally baseless, and completely infuriating. But the most dangerous part wasn't the claim itself. It was the fact that the county had to investigate. A few sentences down, the letter notified me that a site review had been scheduled for the following Friday. A county inspector, accompanied by an environmental consultant, would come out to assess the property and determine the boundaries of public utility. I could almost hear the HOA celebrating on the other side of the fence, convinced they'd found their loophole. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. They weren't trying to take the whole lake this time. They just wanted a foothold, a sliver of ground to claim as shared. From there, they could build their case, twist the narrative, and expand it bit by bit until I had nothing left. But what they didn't know was that I'd been through this kind of battle before. Years earlier, during a drought season, a neighboring developer tried to divert part of the lake for irrigation. I'd fought that all the way up to the State Water Board, and won. Every inch of the lake's perimeter, every change in depth, every outflow and inflow channel was already mapped, recorded, and sealed under my deed. So, instead of panicking, I began preparing. The next few days were spent digging through storage boxes in my office, pulling out old surveys, notarized maps, and copies of court documents. I laid them out across the dining room table like pieces of an old puzzle, every page stamped and signed. It reminded me how much history this land carried, centuries of ownership, blood, and work. This wasn't just real estate, it was legacy. On Thursday, I got a call from a friend in the county office, a quiet favor owed from years of collaboration. He confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA president, a woman named Linda Ward, had personally filed the request. She'd shown up with binders of photographs, testimonials from residents, and even a printed map with a crudely drawn boundary line cutting through my property. She told the board that I was restricting public access to a natural resource. It would have been laughable if it weren't so methodical. She wasn't just grasping at straws anymore. She was trying to manipulate the system itself. When Friday came, I was ready. The county inspector arrived right on time, a middle-aged man with a clipboard, wearing a reflective vest and polite expression. Behind him came a younger woman with a camera and GPS device. And right behind them came a caravan of HOA members, phones out, acting like they were about to witness history. I stayed calm, meeting the inspector by the gate. The HOA group lingered behind the fence, whispering among themselves, already envisioning victory. The inspector went through the motions, checking coordinates, referencing the county's map overlay, and taking photographs. He asked a few procedural questions, nothing out of the ordinary. Then he requested access to the lake perimeter. We walked the trail together, the crunch of gravel under our boots echoing through the trees. I pointed out each survey marker embedded in concrete, each one dated and verified. I even showed him the archived documents proving the water source originated and terminated entirely within my property. No inflow or drainage into public waterways. That made it crystal clear. The lake was private in every sense of the law. The inspector nodded thoughtfully, his expression giving nothing away. The HOA members kept their distance, filming everything like paparazzi at a scandal. When the review was done, he thanked me for my time and promised the county would issue a formal statement once the findings were confirmed. 2 days later, the report came back. The lake was 100% private property, owned and maintained by me alone. The HOA's claim was rejected, and their request for joint jurisdiction was denied with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile on the same grounds again. It should have been over, but instead of conceding, the HOA doubled down. They sent out a community-wide newsletter claiming that while the initial request had been denied, they were exploring legal options to ensure equitable lake access for residents. The letter painted me as a hostile landowner depriving families of nature, making it sound like I was some villain barricading paradise behind barbed wire. And it worked. Overnight, tension rippled through the town. Social media posts popped up from residents of Lakeview Estates, some spreading rumors, others calling for boycotts of my ranch's produce and events. I was suddenly the bad guy in their story, the selfish land baron standing in the way of community harmony, but I wasn't the type to fold under pressure. If they wanted to fight this in public, I'd fight it in plain sight with facts, law, and a quiet kind of force that didn't need to shout. I reached out to the county's communications office and submitted my own statement, complete with the deed, the historical records, and the map signed by the same inspector they'd called. I wanted transparency. I wanted truth. For a few days it worked. The noise started to die down, and some residents began realizing the HOA had exaggerated the entire situation. But then, just as I started to believe peace might return, another storm began brewing. one far more personal than any legal dispute. Late one evening, as I stood by the porch overlooking the lake, I saw something glinting on the water, light catching on movement. A closer look through my binoculars revealed a group of people rowing a small pontoon across the lake. On board, I recognized the unmistakable shape of a red HOA flag fluttering at the bow. They weren't sneaking anymore. They were staking a claim, physically this time. And I realized, as the moonlight caught the waves they left behind, that the battle for the lake was no longer about property lines or paperwork. It had become a matter of pride, power, and defiance, and this time they were coming straight into the water. The wind was still that night, eerily still, like the world was holding its breath. The moon hung low over the lake, its reflection broken only by the ripples from that brazen little pontoon drifting across the water. The red HOA flag fluttered faintly in the night breeze, its pole wedged into a bucket of sand, as if that made their claim official. From the porch of my house, I watched them for several minutes through the binoculars. 5 of them, 3 men, 2 women, all wearing reflective jackets and headlamps, their voices carrying faintly across the water. They weren't hiding this time. They were making a statement, broadcasting it for anyone who might be watching from the lakeside homes on the far bank. The HOA wasn't just trespassing anymore. They were declaring war. The lake had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could think, breathe, and remember. Now, under the glow of those headlamps, it felt defiled, mocked by people who didn't understand the value of peace, who saw nature not as something to respect, but something to control. Their arrogance was staggering. And that red flag? It wasn't just a symbol of their HOA, it was a challenge. I stayed calm, but inside something was boiling. Every step they took into my space, every attempt to rewrite the boundaries of my land, was another insult piled on top of the last. But I wasn't going to storm down there in anger. No, I'd learned long ago that the best revenge was patience and documentation. So I did what any careful landowner would do. I recorded everything. Through the night vision camera mounted near the dock, I captured them rowing, anchoring, planting that ridiculous flag, and even posing for photos. One of the women, Linda Ward, the HOA president herself, stood on the bow, raising her arms like she was some kind of conqueror. I could almost hear her rehearsing the speech she'd give at the next HOA meeting about how she took back the lake for the people. The audacity of it might have been impressive, if it weren't so stupid. I knew better than to confront them directly. Instead, I made a few quiet calls to the county sheriff's department, to my friend at the emergency services office, and to my lawyer, just to make sure every angle was covered. By the time the clock struck midnight, every moment of their little invasion was on record, and every agency that mattered was notified. Still, sleep wouldn't come. I found myself walking down to the shore, boots crunching softly against the gravel, the beam of my flashlight cutting across the reeds. The water was calm, almost indifferent to the drama playing out above it. The flag stood in the center of the lake, its red cloth catching the moonlight like a wound. It was then, standing there in the silence, that I realized how far they were willing to go and how far I'd have to go to stop them. The next morning, the news spread fast. Photos of the flag were all over the HOA's Facebook page, captioned with triumphant nonsense about reclaiming shared heritage. They even held a lake celebration that afternoon, with children running around, families taking selfies, and Linda Ward giving a speech about community unity. It was absurd. And worse, it was dangerous. I watched from my property line, documenting every trespass. Cars lined up along the road, people setting up picnic blankets and coolers on my land, convinced they were in the right. The arrogance was staggering. When I called the sheriff's department, they told me a deputy would come by to assess the situation. But by the time he arrived, most of the crowd had dispersed, leaving behind trash, tire tracks, and the floating flag in the middle of the water. The deputy shook his head, apologized, and said he'd file a report. But he also warned me, off the record, that the HOA wasn't going to stop. "They think you're bluffing," he'd said. "You'll need to show them you're not." That night, I decided to do just that. Around midnight, I launched my small fishing boat and drifted quietly out across the lake. The air was cold, the kind that bites your skin and makes every sound echo twice as loud. The flag loomed closer, its pole anchored in a shallow patch near the center. I pulled alongside it, the hull creaking softly. Up close, the thing looked even more ridiculous, a cheap pole jammed into a weighted base, the flag already fraying at the edges. I stared at it for a long moment, the reflection of the moon shimmering across the torn fabric. It wasn't about property anymore. It was about principle. I reached down, untied the rope anchoring it, and pulled the entire thing into my boat. It was surprisingly light. For a moment, I just sat there, the flag coiled in my lap like a defeated trophy. Then I rowed back to shore, carried it up to the dock, and leaned it against the shed. By sunrise, the flag was gone from the water, but the real storm was just beginning. When the HOA members discovered it missing, the neighborhood erupted. Accusations flew across their social media pages. Claims of theft, vandalism, even destruction of community property. Within hours, I received another letter, this time from an HOA attorney demanding the flag's return and threatening civil action. That same afternoon, 2 patrol cars pulled up to my gate. The deputies were polite but serious. They had to respond to a report of property damage and intimidation. I led them to the shed, showed them the flag, and handed over the full video footage of the HOA planting it on my private property. They didn't even need to review the whole thing before shaking their heads in disbelief. The lead deputy radioed it in, confirming that the HOA had indeed trespassed and unlawfully placed the flag. Their little stunt had officially backfired. But instead of satisfaction, I felt something heavier, a sense of inevitability. Linda Ward wasn't going to stop. People like her never did. Losing publicly only fueled them. She'd twist this story until she was the victim and I was the aggressor. I could already see it in her next HOA newsletter, the way she'd spin it. Local rancher destroys symbol of unity. As night fell, I sat by the fire pit near the water, the red flag folded neatly at my feet. I didn't burn it, not yet. Instead, I placed it inside an old lockbox, along with the videos, letters, and every bit of evidence I'd gathered since the first confrontation, because something told me I'd need it all soon, and I was right. A few days later, I got a call from my lawyer. The HOA had filed a civil injunction claiming psychological distress and loss of community access. They weren't just fighting for the lake anymore. They were fighting to drag me through court, drain my resources, and make an example of me. But they didn't realize one crucial thing. That 911 call they'd made weeks earlier, the one that came straight to my office, it wasn't just a funny coincidence. It was a legal record, complete with false statements and misuse of emergency services. And that single file had the power to turn their entire case inside out. As I looked out over the dark water that night, the reflection of the stars shimmering on the surface, I felt something shift inside me. The time for patience was over. The HOA had turned my lake into a battlefield, and I was done defending. It was time to strike back, with truth, law, and precision. The lawsuit came faster than I expected. Within a week of their flag fiasco, I was holding a thick envelope stamped with the county court's seal. Inside were pages of accusations, carefully crafted by the HOA's attorney, each one more absurd than the last. They claimed intentional infliction of emotional distress, theft of symbolic property, and interference with community recreation rights. It was a performance, on paper, written to make me look like a tyrant, guarding a lake from innocent families. But beneath all that noise was something far more dangerous. They weren't just suing for access anymore. They were petitioning the court to classify the lake as a shared natural resource. If they won, I wouldn't just lose the lake. I'd lose the one thing that anchored this ranch to my family's history. For days, my office turned into a war room. Legal documents covered every inch of the long oak table. Maps, water rights records, old surveys, everything was out again, marked with sticky notes and color-coded tabs. My lawyer, an old friend named Carson, sat across from me going through each line of the HOA's claim. He looked equal parts amused and disgusted. "They're bluffing," he said. "But they're loud. And loud gets attention. He was right. The HOA wasn't relying on truth. They were relying on optics, public sympathy, the kind of emotional narrative that made people stop thinking logically. And in a town like ours, where gossip traveled faster than wind, perception could be more powerful than fact. Meanwhile, Linda Ward was everywhere. She gave interviews to local blogs, showed up at community meetings, and even managed to get a short segment on the local morning news. She stood on the lakeside road, looking into the camera, talking about how the community was being denied its heritage. Behind her, the lake glittered like an accomplice. Every word was calculated. Every gesture was meant to paint her as the hero. But Linda had forgotten something critical. In her obsession with the spotlight, she'd left a trail of lies, and I had proof of everyone. The turning point came 3 nights before our first court hearing. It was just after 9 p.m. when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed dispatch office. Normally, that wouldn't be unusual. I still oversaw the county's emergency services system, after all. But this call wasn't routine. When I answered, the voice on the other end was tense. "Sir, we thought you should know," the dispatcher said. "We had another 911 call from Lakeview Estates tonight, claiming a violent altercation near the lake." My stomach tightened. I opened the system logs from my home terminal, the screen lighting my face in pale blue. There it was, a 911 call made at 8:47 p.m., originating from Linda Ward's address. The transcript, automatically generated by the system, recorded every word. Linda had claimed that I was brandishing a weapon and threatening HOA members who were peacefully visiting community property. It was a complete fabrication. At the time of the call, I'd been at a county meeting 15 miles away, verified by security footage and attendance logs. This wasn't just slander. It was a crime. I printed the entire transcript along with the time-stamped system data showing that the call was classified as false report. Administrative flag issued. The moment she made that call, the system logged her voice, address, and intent. And that meant I now had the single piece of evidence that could unravel everything she'd built. By morning, Carson and I had filed a counterclaim for defamation, harassment and abuse of emergency services. The court accepted it immediately, merging it with the existing lawsuit for review. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't on the offensive anymore. They were on defense. When the first hearing finally arrived, the courtroom was full. HOA members sat in neat rows behind their attorney, whispering like schoolchildren waiting for a lecture. On my side, it was just me, Carson, and a folder thicker than a phone book. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and no patience for theatrics, listened quietly as the HOA's attorney launched into his opening argument. He painted a picture of a wealthy landowner bullying a small, tight-knit community. I could see the smirks from the HOA board members, convinced they'd already won. Then Carson stood and began to speak. Calm, measured, and precise. He didn't argue feelings, he presented facts. Ownership documents, legal surveys, county inspection results. Every piece of evidence was undeniable. Then, just as the HOA attorney began to protest, Carson pulled out the 911 transcript. The courtroom went silent as the audio clip played. Linda Ward's voice echoed through the speakers. Filled with false panic and rehearsed fear, she claimed I was shouting threats, waving a gun, and blocking access to public water. The dispatcher's calm voice responded, asking for details. Then came the timestamp, 8:47 p.m., and the final note confirming the report was false after deputies found no one at the scene. When the clip ended, the judge leaned forward. "Is this accurate?" she asked. Carson nodded. "Your Honor, it came directly from the County Emergency Services database. My client oversees that office. This isn't speculation. It's government record." The shift in the room was instant. The smug confidence on the HOA's faces dissolved. Linda Ward's expression turned pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Her attorney tried to object, stammering something about misunderstandings and miscommunication, but the damage was done. The judge called for a recess. When she returned, her tone was final. She dismissed the HOA's claims with prejudice, again, and referred the matter of the false 911 call to the county prosecutor for review. Then, in a decision that would echo through the community for months, she ordered the HOA to pay all court costs and legal fees, citing willful abuse of legal process. The silence from their side of the courtroom was almost satisfying. Almost. But victory didn't feel like I thought it would. As Carson and I walked out into the afternoon light, I looked back at the crowd of HOA members. Some looked angry. Others looked embarrassed. And a few, surprisingly, looked relieved, like they'd been trapped under Linda's leadership and finally saw it crumble. That night, I returned to the lake. The air was cold and quiet again, just like it had been before all this started. The moonlight spread across the water like liquid silver. For the first time in months, it was still. No flags, no boats, no noise. Just peace. I thought maybe it was over, that finally I could have my life back. But as I stood there, the phone in my pocket buzzed. A new email? The sender, anonymous. The subject line read, "You don't know what she's planning next." I opened it, frowning. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, taken from a distance. It showed Linda Ward standing with two men I didn't recognize near what looked like construction equipment parked by the far edge of the lake. The message beneath it was short. "She's not done. They're building something, and it's on your land." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. The courtroom might have ended one battle, but this war wasn't over. Not even close. The message lingered in my inbox long after midnight. The photograph burned into my mind. The grainy image showed Linda Ward standing near heavy machinery, an excavator, a generator, and a cluster of men in reflective vests. Behind them, the shoreline sloped down toward the far end of my lake. Even through the poor resolution, I recognized that patch of land immediately. It was mine. A secluded area of the ranch that hadn't seen activity in years. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the photo. After everything, the false 911 call, the lawsuit, the public humiliation, she was still pushing. Still scheming, and now, it seemed, she'd crossed the line from manipulation into outright trespass. At dawn, I drove out to the far edge of the lake where the property line cut through a thicket of willow trees. The road narrowed into an old dirt trail, one I hadn't used in years except for maintenance. As I approached, I could hear the low hum of machinery. My stomach tightened. Through the trees, I saw them, 6 workers in hard hats, 2 trucks, and a bright orange portable generator. They were digging. A shallow trench stretched along the bank, snaking dangerously close to the water line. And right there, supervising like she owned the place, stood Linda Ward, clipboard in hand. I parked the truck and walked closer, my boots sinking into the damp soil. The workers glanced up, uncertain. Linda turned, and for a brief second, her confidence faltered. Then she straightened her back and forced a smile as if we were 2 business partners meeting for a scheduled site visit. Of course, there were no words exchanged. None were needed. I didn't yell, didn't threaten. I just held up my phone, started recording, and panned across the scene. Every face, every truck, every inch of trespass captured. Then I pointed silently to the private property sign they'd trampled near the entrance. One of the workers muttered something about having permits. I asked to see them. None could produce a single paper. The supposed project, I would later learn, was a half-baked plan by the HOA to build a community dock, a structure that would physically extend from their side of the neighborhood into my lake, giving them an artificial access point. Linda had presented it as a pre-approved community initiative. The problem was, she had no approval. Within an hour, the sheriff's department arrived, same deputies from before. They took statements, snapped photos, and escorted the workers off the property. Linda tried to argue, of course, claiming the construction was temporary and misunderstood. But the deputies didn't buy it. When they left, the once bustling construction site fell silent again. The trench, half dug and uneven, looked like a scar across the earth. The lake beyond it rippled gently in the morning light, as if sighing in relief. I stood there a long time, watching the water reclaim its calm. But something inside me had changed. For months, I'd been defending, reacting, responding, proving myself innocent of lies. Every move I'd made had been measured, cautious, bound by patience and law. But this was different. Linda had invaded the land itself, torn into the soil that carried generations of my family's history. That wasn't something I could tolerate anymore. That afternoon, I made 2 phone calls. One to my lawyer, the other to the county's property assessor's office. Within 48 hours, I filed a formal cease and desist order against the HOA for trespassing, property damage, and unauthorized construction. Then, using the same county connections Linda had tried to exploit, I requested a boundary reaffirmation audit, a legal process that not only confirmed my ownership, but established physical enforcement rights over the property line. Once approved, I would have full authority to restrict all access, permanently. And when the ruling came through a week later, it did exactly that. The HOA's development plans were shut down indefinitely. The equipment they'd brought onto my land was seized as evidence in the investigation. Linda herself was fined for negligent authorization of construction without jurisdiction. Her name appeared in the local paper under the headline, HOA President Fined for Illegal Development on Private Land. For the first time, the tide had turned publicly. Residents of Lakeview Estates, once her loyal followers, began questioning everything. Many demanded her resignation. Some sent apology letters to me directly. A few even offered to help repair the damaged shoreline, but I didn't respond. I didn't want apologies. I wanted peace. And peace at last was returning. Weeks passed. The lake healed. The trench filled in naturally, grass slowly reclaiming the dirt. The sound of construction was replaced once more by the rustle of wind through cattails. Every evening I'd sit by the dock with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset stretch across the still water. For the first time in months, it was quiet, truly quiet. Then one day I received a small brown envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, a resignation letter from Linda Ward, addressed to the Lakeview Estates HOA board. It was brief, almost cold. She cited personal reasons and loss of community trust. At the bottom, in small handwriting, there was a note. You win. The lake is yours. I set the letter down, staring out the window at the water glinting in the afternoon sun. It wasn't about winning. It never had been. It was about holding on to what mattered, not out of pride, but out of respect for the generations that came before me. The HOA soon elected a new president, a quiet man named George who reached out to me directly. He proposed a truce, a written acknowledgement of property lines, a promise that Lakeview Estates would cease all activity near the water. I agreed on one condition. They would install a new fence, one that followed the exact surveyed boundary and included clear signage at every 50-foot mark. 2 weeks later, the fence was up. Tall, sturdy, and undeniable. The final line. As I stood there watching the workers finish the last section, the air was warm, the lake calm, and the horizon bathed in gold. The reflection of the fence shimmered across the surface, marking a division not just of land, but of peace hard-earned. The world beyond that line would keep spinning. New residents would move in, new problems would come and go. But here, on this side, everything would stay as it was meant to be. Quiet, private, free. When the sun dipped low and the water turned silver, I walked to the edge of the dock, the same place where this entire feud had begun. I reached into the old lockbox, pulled out that folded red HOA flag, and looked at it one last time. Then, without a word, I tossed it into the fire pit beside me. The fabric caught quickly, curling into smoke, the flames reflecting in the water like distant stars. As the fire died and the first crickets began to sing, I sat back, feeling the weight of the months finally lift. The HOA had called 911 to kick me off my own lake, not realizing the call came straight to my office. And in the end, that single mistake had exposed every lie they'd built. Now the lake was silent again, not with tension, not with defiance, but with peace. The kind that comes only after a storm. And as the embers faded into darkness, I knew one thing for certain. No one would ever challenge this land again. It wasn't just mine. It was home.